Hey folks, and welcome to the final episode of Tweak Week here on Passion for Sound. If you haven't seen the rest of the Tweak Week videos, what I've been doing is working through a bunch of different tweaks you can make to your audio systems to improve the sound, and working out whether they're worth it, sharing my thoughts and impressions with you so you can decide if they're worth it. And what I started with was the Burson Audio V7 op amps, then an audiophile fuse test, and then I've moved through a bunch of Tellurium Q cables, starting with their speaker cables was first, then the power cable, moving on to yesterday was the RCA cables, and now I've got their USB cable. So what I've got here is the Tellurium Q Black version 2 USB cable. This one comes in at about $300 for the 1 meter cable, at least I think it's a meter, maybe it's 80 centimeters. It comes in at about $300 for the shortest length. And that means that it's definitely a premium USB cable, and so I'm keen to put it up against a couple of others that I've got here in the Curious Evolved USB and also the Tubulus Concentus USB. Now I'm going to start off with the Tubulus Concentus cable because so far that's the very best cable that I've tried. And the Tubulus cable comes in a little bit more expensive than the Tellurium Q, so it's going to be interesting to see just how well it performs. What I'm going to do for this test to keep it really simple is I'm going to plug both cables into my computer. The USB output card that I've got there is a JCAT USB card. That gives me two identical outputs. I'm going to feed them one at a time into the back of the shit Yggdrasil. That's just the easiest DAC for me to get to and make the swap, and have a listen to it playing through the Tellurium Amp 23R here. So I'm going to start off with the Tellurium Q, then I'm going to go over to the Tubulus Concentus, which should be better based on price, and see which of these cables I prefer. So this might be the most interesting test I've done so far because it's a very, very close call. It's actually probably on par with the Curious RCA and the Tellurium Q Black version 2 RCA. And that's to say that the difference between these two USB cables, that being the Tubulus Concentus USB and the Tellurium Q USB, specifically the Black version 2 of course, the difference here is very, very subtle, and it's one of those that's very much going to come down to personal preference. And so I'm not even going to bother bringing the Curious Evolved USB cable into this because I found the Tubulus Concentus to be clearly better than the Curious Evolved, which is already a great cable. What I'm hearing though as I go between the Tubulus Concentus and the Tellurium Q is the sound has just got a slightly different character. Both of them are delivering an amazing sense of space and imaging accuracy and image focus. And by the way, for those getting furious at me for suggesting that USB cables can sound different, it all comes down to any of the noise they're allowing to get into the system or therefore shielding out of the system. And so in both of these cases, these cables, whatever they're doing, is helping to keep as much noise out of the system and allowing the sound to have more sense of space, more sense of clarity of the image and focus of the image. But where things differ, and this is the only place they differ, is that I feel like there's a little tiny bit more, I don't know if it's texture or if it's a little bit of clarity or maybe even harshness in the treble from the Tellurium cable, whereas the Concentus is just perfectly smooth. Not smooth in the sense that I'm missing anything, but smooth in the sense that it's the easier of the two to listen to. Going back and forth, and I just switched about 4 or 5 times between them, it was undeniable to me that without touching the volume on the amplifier and having the same track playing through the DAC, through the headphones, through the amp, nothing else changing, each time I felt like I wanted to turn the volume down with the Tellurium Q just a little bit, whereas with the Concentus, I was perfectly happy at the volume I was. And then everything else, as I said, was exactly equal. Now, one thing that I'm aware of as I look at the two cables is the Concentus cable is actually a dual cable, so it's split in the middle, and that's therefore probably keeping any of the power lines within USB completely separate from the audio lines with their own shielding, and that might be part of why it sounds different. Generally speaking, if extra noise is getting into the system, it's going to come across as harshness. And that might be, I'm not saying it is, but it might be what I'm hearing the Tellurium Q. Now, when I say it might be, I don't mean it might be a difference. There is definitely a difference. What I mean is the cause might be that there's noise in the power line that's getting into the system. Now, I'm using a galvanically isolated DAC in the Iggy OG, so that in some ways shouldn't actually have any impact from the USB cable, and yet it still does. I don't understand that part of it. I can't explain it. What I can tell you though is that these two cables both sound fantastic, and I would choose between them based on whether or not you want that extra little bit of clarity and energy in the top end in your system, whether you want that or whether you want a slightly more laid back overall sound. And I don't mean laid back in terms of lacking details or clarity. What I mean is that if your system is such that you don't really want any extra energy or clarity in the top end, then I'd probably head towards the Concentus. But on the other hand, if you're listening to your system and you're wishing for just that little bit more clarity, that's where heading across towards the Tellurium Q might actually be beneficial. Both of them are incredibly enjoyable, and I could make an argument for either being better than the other based on what I'm hearing and therefore what it is that you might be looking for. But as it is, I think I'm just going to say they're both excellent. And so it comes down to A, cost, because the Tellurium Q is a bit cheaper, and then B, as I said, whether you want that little bit of extra sense of clarity, maybe a tiny little bit more texture and attack in the top end that I was hearing from the Tellurium Q. And the other thing I should mention, and I have mentioned this in the previous videos, I'm not for a second suggesting that you should go out and spend $300+ on USB cables until everything else in your system is just right. I think it's really important to get the rest of your devices in place, your major components like a streamer, a DAC, a headphone amp, a power amp, a preamp, all that stuff should be in place before you invest in these cables. And that's where, for me, these are tweaks, hence Tweak Week. These are things that you add towards the end of your journey when you just want to tweak it a little bit. Get that little bit more sense of space, imaging, separation, clarity, texture, smoothness. These are the things that these sorts of tweaks, in this case USB cables, can bring to the system. And of course, the other thing to keep in mind is that they can be more and less influential depending on the system. I'm yet to try a system that is completely agnostic to the USB cable, except for when it goes into a digital to digital converter before it comes back out, and then that might depend on the digital to digital converter. For me, that didn't make any difference that I noticed, although I haven't gone back to double check that. But definitely, if you're doing a direct connection from a streamer into a DAC or a PC into a DAC, then upgrading the USB cable can be a really nice step forward, but only once you've got everything else in place. Of course, if you want to invest in a high-end USB cable and then kind of upgrade around it, that's fine as well, of course. But my point here is don't buy expensive USB cables to go with cheap equipment. You're not going to get the benefits out of them, and it's a waste of money. You can get much more bang for buck putting that money into your main devices. But all that said, if you're interested in getting a better USB cable, just as I've said with the previous three, I think the Tellurium Q gear is absolutely brilliant. I've now tested 4 of their cables over the last 4 days, and all 4 are fantastic. In terms of absolute sonic performance, I think the power cable was the standout. I think the speaker cables came in a very close second. And for me, the RCA and the USB were a step down in terms of the impact that I heard in my system. But having said that, those cables are also cheaper than what I'm already using. And so what this is telling me is that Tellurium Q is a wonderful brand to buy your cables from. If I was starting out now and I was looking to buy all the cables for my system, I think I'd just shop at Tellurium Q and be done with it. And as I said previously, there's no affiliation, there's no connection with Tellurium. I get no kickbacks if you buy from there. But what I'm seeing is that their attention to detail in crafting their cables, whatever sort of cable it is, consistently results, at least in the Black 2 series, I can't speak to any of their other cables, but with the Black version 2, all of the cables have a consistency to them, which is that they're delivering a sense of space, a sense of soundstage size, image focus. And what I mean by that is they're getting out of the way of the music and allowing the music to shine through. That allows individual sounds to pop out to you, to really enhance the listening experience without changing anything about the signal coming through. And so I'm a huge fan of what I've heard. I'm certainly going to be shopping with Tellurium Q in the future when I need to buy more cables, because I think what they're doing is really fantastic, and based on what I've heard and seen here, very affordable too for what you're getting in terms of performance. And so I hope you found Tweak Week interesting. Hopefully you've enjoyed the series of discussions that I've had here. And if you have found this video, and indeed all the videos, helpful, useful or informative, then please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave it to the music. Happy tweaking of audio gear, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.